Well, hello, and good afternoon and good evening, everybody out there in America, all over the world. Welcome back to another live episode of Two Legs. We've gone live for our last proper episode, and we had to go live again today because we're simply having an early, wonderful Christmas time, because today is the 10th of December, and it is the day that the McCartney Legacy Volume 2 has been published worldwide, available everywhere now, and none other than co-authors Allan Kozinn and Adrian Sinclair are back on Two Legs again to join us as we launch and celebrate the release of the McCartney Legacy Volume 2. Good afternoon and good evening, gentlemen. Welcome back.
Hey, Andy and Tom. Hey. Great to be here.
Hey.
Absolutely. So you've had quite the whirlwind day already. I know it's 8:30 locally for Adrian, and you guys have been making the rounds, doing interviews all day. So it probably has been, hopefully we've saved the best for last.
Yep, definitely.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
No problem, and we will get to everybody's comments. You've emailed, you put a few in the comments. We will get to all those. We've got a rundown, of course, of a couple of questions as well that we're going to run through as well as we go throughout the show. Allan and Adrian have graciously given us some of their time, so we're going to stay on the air for about an hour today. So we will get ready to rock and roll. With the first question, number one, hold on, here we go. Oh, we got to pull it up now. Of course, I can't find it now. Well, let me go with the first question with a comment here until I can find my own. Jimmy Rutles says, my first question was, what was the most difficult part of writing and researching Volume 2 compared to Volume 1?
Well, that's an interesting one, Jimmy. Well, I guess the sort of burning question on every Wings fan's mind was when was the last time that John and Paul saw one another? So we dedicated quite a lot of time and research into really getting to the bottom of answering that question once and for all. And we don't want to really give too much away, but
nope.
I think we document in quite a lot of detail all the various encounters that John and Paul had and meetups, throughout 74 to 80, and some of the meetups that didn't happen for various reasons. Yeah, but we don't want to give away too many spoilers. But nope. Yeah, I'd say that was, from our perspective, it was the question we were asked the most frequently by people, and one that we dedicated the most amount of time to trying to answer.
The one thing I would say as well is that when you read the book, like, there is no place where we ever say, and this was the last time they saw each other, because we're trying to write without foreknowledge. So, we are exploring these events as they happen. So the last time they see each other in this book is actually the last time they see each other, but we don't sort of flag that as that event, just so people know.
Right, and that was a method of writing that you told us about 2 years ago when Volume 1 came out. The ability to write a story without foreknowledge, even though we know the knowledge, is an interesting way to tell a narrative.
It's hard.
It is very hard.
Yeah. It was a rule. It was really you could call it a rule in inverted commas that I imposed, because I felt that it would just make the book more compelling to read, and my background is in documentary filmmaking. And Alan's background is as a music critic. So really, when you're reading our books, you're reading our two worlds coming together, which is, my kind of mind, which works like a filmmaker. I look at things like scenes and chapters, and Alan brings a whole different skill set. With his, ridiculous knowledge that he brings from all his 38 years at the New York Times. So yeah, when you're picking up our volumes, you're really finding our two worlds colliding, and that's the reason why we did it without foreknowledge. It's my fault.
Yeah.
We'll just blame you, Adrian.
Yeah.
Let me get one quick in because my throat's messed up, but I want to try to get it in early. But like Denny Sywell, he was a big help with his journal and diary, as you say. Another drummer was a big help for you guys too, Jeff Britton. He had a lot of writing down dates and stuff like that. Talk about how Jeff Britton was a big help for you guys for this volume 2.
Yeah, well, Jeff hadn't really been on the scene for quite some time. And then he showed up in Nashville and he did that event that was organised by Dan Ely to celebrate, was it the 45th anniversary of Junior's Farm?
Right.
Yes.
Right. And he did a couple of short interviews around that time. And I'd really been desperate to speak with Jeff. And eventually, thanks to Dan Ely, in fact, I was able to get in touch with him. And I actually flew out to where Jeff lives now. And we spent some time together, got to know one another. And eventually he opened up and we did an interview together. And then something like 4 or 5 months later, we ended up in lockdown. And it was at that time that Jeff told me that when he was in Wings that he kept these little diaries. So we spent a lot of time on Zoom talking to one another, talking about what was going on in the world during the pandemic. And then he walked me through, day for day what he was doing with Wings in 1974 and 75. So, when you read chapters like Nashville, and you wonder where all that information came from, where all that detail came from, then, the world has Jeff Britton to thank for that, really, for having the foresight to document his life. And then also, as we say in the acknowledgements of the book, to hold on to those diaries, even when some of the memories that are in them were so difficult to revisit, and it really was difficult for Jeff to revisit some of these memories. I think still to this day, Jeff still hasn't quite processed why he was booted from the band, and I think reading our book will be another difficult journey for Jeff, but hopefully it'll give him some closure.
Hopefully,
Right, because you're reading the book and you seem like he's getting along with Paul, he's getting along with Linda. I mean, and whereas there was Jimmy and Denny who are really giving Paul the hard time during this, first half of the volume 2, and it looks like he did want to, end the band, altogether, but he sticks with it. But yeah, unfortunately, he's the one he's kind of in a way, the scapegoat. I mean, he has a virtuoso guitar player now. I mean, obviously, with all his antics, you still want to keep him though, because that takes a lot of pressure off of Paul. He doesn't have to, perform as much.
Yeah. With Jeff, they ran into some difficulties for him drumming on certain things during the sessions for Venus and Mars. And he was having a hard time. I'm not sure entirely why, but at one point someone suggested that he have a few tokes. I mean, he was a teetotaler. He didn't smoke, he didn't drink, but someone said, maybe you really need to loosen up a bit. And he did. And that did help. But then, a few sessions later, he was having problems again. And that's when sort of he ran into the sort of buzzsaw of Paul's frustration, because Paul wants things to be the way he wants them. And he basically just said, okay, we'll get another drummer. But, as you say, in Nashville, Jeff got along with Paul and Linda very well. And, not that there weren't some frustrations. I mean, when a policeman decided to gift a gun to Jeff, because it's a strange thing for a British person to see people walking around with guns, and he just wanted to have one, and he shot it onto the ground, and Paul heard about it, and he said, if you do that again, you're out. So, but generally speaking, he was kind of a peacemaker within the band at that time. When Paul was thinking of just scuttling the whole thing, he was the one who talked him into, giving, Jimmy and Denny some leeway and keeping it together, because as he argued, all bands have these problems, which, Paul would have known too. But yeah, it just was kind of a difficult thing. I really feel for him.
Yeah, the other thing that came through from Jeff's diaries was, and things you would never have heard about before, were things like Jeff breaking a bone in his heel before they went to do the Nashville sessions, and he was advised to put a cast on it, which meant he wouldn't have been able to drum. And Jeff knew that would have been game over, so he played through the pain, wore a pair of stiffened boots, and did everything he could to kind of weather the storm there, really. So there was an awful lot going on in the background there for poor Jeff as well, having to deal with things on a physical and emotional level. And yeah, you do have to feel for him, like Alan said. For sure.
One of the things that I've seen some comments about the book and your writing is that why include the Beatle narrative throughout this? And I think I saw a comment that Adrian posted to an answer on this. And some people have said, well, why does there have to be Beatles stories tied into the Wings stories? And would either you care to? I know the answer, but some people felt that this is just like, why can't it just be about Wings? Why do we have to constantly come back and forth to stories of Apple or John? And I know the answer. We all know the answer. But some people are like, well, why can't this just be about Wings? Alan, Adrian?
Yeah, it can't be just about Wings as if nothing else exists in the world. I mean, we're writing a biography of Paul, and Paul's world includes the other Beatles and the Beatles as a group, even though it's in the past. We see EMI putting out rock and roll music and love songs and various things, and basically wanting to exploit the catalog, which they're entitled to do because they own the material. Paul's approach to that was, well, you know what? Nothing we can do about it. I don't care. John and Ringo and George, to some extent, had a different feeling about that. And Paul ultimately came around to their point of view. And if you look at Paul today, he's a major force in what EMI or Universal does or with the Beatles material. So, if we were writing about Adrian and I kept turning up in the story, people, you couldn't say, well, why does Alan keep turning up? Well, they've done 2 books together, it's, this is Paul's world. We're writing about Paul's world, and the Beatles are in Paul's world. I don't even understand the question, to tell you the truth. Why would, I don't understand why anybody would have that problem, because this is what it is.
Well, they're all intertwined too. I mean, you see George pop up at the Venus and Mars, after party. I mean, you see Paul going to see George. I mean, they're all interwoven in their lives. So it makes sense that you guys would include that in the book, and I'm glad you did.
Yeah, and if you look at the first book, the Beatles had a direct influence on the music Paul was writing. If you look at the songs on Ram, some of them were direct messages to John. And then even on Wildlife, he wrote "Dear Friend" as a letter to John, really. So how do you separate the Beatles from a former Beatle? Like Alan said, it's not even really a question, is it? It's kind of that was his world.
It is
and
his
we're
world.
writing about his world.
Yeah, accurately and historically, which is the right way to do it. So yeah. Let's just go back into just kind of the logistics of Volume 2. Was there immediate plans for Volume 2 upon Volume 1? Like, would the publisher greenlight it, or you had to sell it? How hard was it to go right off the bat?
Well, we were contracted for the first 2 volumes on the theory that we wanted to do more, but the initial contract was for those 2. So this sort of brings us through the contract, and we now have to do the next contract.
we now have to dance the dance again. Yeah.
Well, and that's why we need Volume 2 to do very, very well, because we really, really want this series to continue as it should. But you did research everything at the same time. Did you not?
Yeah, we did. Yeah. So, I mean, we've been working on this now for 10 years, maybe just over 10 years. And yeah, we really researched these 2 volumes side by side. So when we finished work on Volume 1, we kind of had most of the major timeline in place for Volume 2. And really, there was a greater division of labour with this book. With the first book, I maybe wrote a quarter. That's maybe an exaggeration. About a quarter of the first book, whereas Alan wrote most of this book. I think I wrote maybe 2 chapters of this volume. So there was a greater division of labour. Alan wrote Volume 2 while I was continuing research in the background of whatever we were doing, and picking up maybe interviews that we'd missed along the way. And some of them turned out to be quite major interviews in the end, although we did have quite a lot already in the can, before we started work on Volume 2, writing it.
Great segue. So, I mean, I'm only up to chapter 11, and I've loved the contributions that you've gotten from people like Alan O'Duffy and Tony Dorsey. Those insights have been incredible, what those gentlemen have had to say. But what are some of your favorite interviews and people that have given you some great stories, just off the top of your head throughout the whole book, that have given you the best? Again, without giving not too much away.
Stephen Thomas was one I thought was one of the best, because Stephen Thomas had designed a department store called Biba in London, which makes an appearance towards the end of Volume 1. Paul and Linda spent some time there. They really liked it. It was Art Deco, and they thought it was a cool place. And they decided that when it was time to renovate One Soho Square to become MPL's headquarters, they wanted to hire those guys who did Biba, and they did. And Stephen Thomas was one of them. And so they had very specific ideas of what they wanted for MPL's headquarters, which Stephen Thomas told us all about, and we wouldn't have even, really thought in those terms before debriefing him, so to speak. And then Paul invited him up to Scotland to turn a cow barn into a studio because he wanted to record Mull of Kintyre. But my favorite part of the Stephen Thomas interviews was when he told us that he wasn't even particularly a Beatles fan. He was more of a Stones fan. And if he was a Beatles fan, he would have been more of a John fan than a Paul fan. And that he told this to Paul right out. And he felt that that actually worked to his favor, because Paul knew that he wouldn't be lying to him. He wouldn't be a sycophant. And, they could work together as professionals together. And there's a great story in there. I don't know if I should tell the whole thing. Adrian, what do you think about playing Mull of Kintyre for him? Yeah, we'll go for that one.
Why not?
When the studio's finished and Mull of Kintyre sessions are over, Paul invites Steve Thomas back up to Scotland. And he walks in, and no one is in the kitchen where, you walk into High Park. There's just a boom box with a cassette leaning on it. And so he waits for Paul, makes himself some tea. Paul comes in and plays the cassette and said, I think you want to know what your work was for. Plays the tape, and Stephen Thomas says, I really don't like it. It's just awful. And Paul said, well, listen to it again. And he played it to him like 14 times. Until finally, Steve said, well, I like it. And Paul said, I know you don't, but this is for you. And he took out another cassette from his pocket and handed it to him. And it was Girls' School, which is, a rocker and much more the kind of thing that Stephen Thomas would like. And I just thought that was a great story. And without interviewing someone like Stephen Thomas, we would never have heard anything like that. So, we looked up, Adrian, I have to say, Adrian particularly found, people at Showco to talk about the tour, the 75-76 tour in incredible detail. And Steve Thomas and a lot of people who, most people wouldn't even think about. But we got them into this, and it I think made the book something that no one else has done.
No, even like Morris Leiter, like we're reading all from all the Showco ins and outs of the technical details of the touring and some of the mishaps during the touring and things that we would never ever hear about at all. And here you're getting insight from people. Adrian, off the top of your head?
That Showco was a big one for us, really, because they'd been burned before, apparently, Showco, when someone approached them to do interviews, and they weren't really keen on speaking to anyone. And eventually I convinced them to help us out, explain what we were doing with the project. And they gave us access to their archives and access to their people. And we could have spoken to a lot more people than we did, actually. But the thing with the 75-76 tour was, how do you make a tour interesting to a reader? Because what we didn't want to do is just present And then they arrived, and then they played the concert, and this was the review, and then they left. We wanted to give people that kind of fly on the wall feel of what does it feel like to be on the road with Paul McCartney and Wings. And I feel like some of the guys from Shoko gave us a lot of that. And we found other stories in places like Rolling Stone, where Rolling Stone were doing coverage of the tour, and a lot of that comes through in the book. So they really kind of lit up the 75-76 tour for us. But like Alan said, for me, some of my favourite interviews are some of the lesser known characters, that we've spoken to. I spoke to Willie Russell, the playwright, who wrote originally John, Paul, George, Ringo and Bert, which Paul hated, and it was a real honour to speak to someone like Willie, who's so revered as a playwright and a filmmaker, in Great Britain and probably around the world. And then he went on to work with Paul on the Band on the Run project in the late 70s, which maybe some people haven't heard about, and we get a bit of insight about that. And then just kind of some of the slightly random people we spoke to who did studio sessions with Paul. So we tracked down, for example, the fiddle player who played on Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reggae, a guy called Bob Loveday, and I interviewed him. And I won't give too much away, but Bob really gives a very good description of that recording session, which also involved them making some music for the karate film that Paul was doing at the time with Jeff Britton, called Empty Hand. Yes. And Bob really explains why that song turned out the way it did. Let's just say there was some chemical influence there.
Of course, which seems to be the common denominator with a lot of this material, as I said on email. One other question, which we can talk about it because it did get published just yesterday, I think, in The Guardian, was this collaboration possibly between Paul McCartney and Isaac Asimov on a potential film.
Sci-fi.
With the whole sci-fi thing that Paul was going through there in the 74, 75 with Venus and Mars. Alan or Adrian, if you'd like to give us a précis of that project.
Well, I can explain to you how we found out about it. Really, it was one of those things that had been a rumor online for a while. People had talked about this Asimov story, and I think it was mentioned by Asimov in his biography, or one of his biographies. He did a couple of memoirs, and I thought, it'd be really interesting to find out, what this film was. What was it called? What was the premise of the film? So I did some exploring, and I found some documents in a Boston University archive, which houses Asimov's archives. And I thought I'd have to fly to Boston. Usually you have to go to the university and scan the documents. But it just so happened that I contacted them during the pandemic when nobody could travel. So a very kind researcher went down to the archive, pulled out the box and scanned all of these documents and sent them to me. So all of a sudden, Alan and I found, we had not only, this confirmation of this story that Paul was working on a project with Asimov, but we had a lot of detail about what it was they were collaborating on together, and how it evolved during their collaboration and how it ended. And it's all there in the book. I think the film was it originally titled 5 and 5 and 1?
Right. Yeah.
Which kind of has a little bit of a musical ring to it, doesn't it? It's like almost like 1 and 1 is 2, like one of those kind of old musical references that kind of Paul tried to work in there. But it seems to have taken on a life of its own over the last few days since the story was broken by The Observer in England. And,
that's right.
And now it's on NME and
everywhere,
Billboard and everywhere. Yeah. Every time we refresh the news feed, it's popping up somewhere else. But that was a fascinating discovery to make during this. And then that evolves during the 70s into a second collaboration with Gene Roddenberry, which again people might have heard about before. We got to the bottom of why and when that collaboration ended. It's all there in the book.
Let me get to one more before we get to more people's questions watching. But he rehearses "Hey Jude" in April of '75. Are you surprised he never plays it until '89? there's just so much. I mean, the song is so universally loved. I mean, it's the biggest hit, and I'm kind of surprised that he just doesn't perform it during the the world tour or the '79 tour. And then on top of that, then because the Beatles is all through this book still, but then getting the publishing rights for Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You, I didn't realize that was during negotiations for in '75, and that was re-signing with Capitol, or was that re-signing with EMI?
I think EMI.
EMI, right?
Okay.
Yeah, another sort of side current in this book is Paul's life as a music publisher, which is
Right.
something he has taken very seriously and has assembled an astonishing catalog of things that he now controls the rights to. And it really started off, back in volume 1 when he was trying to figure out what to do with his money, as an investment. And Lee Eastman, who was also involved with music publishing very closely, suggested, you should do something that you love, and you love music, and music publishing is, a really interesting field. Why don't you try that? And then Buddy Holly's catalog came up for sale. Paul bought it. So he now owns a catalog of someone who, was one of his idols as a kid coming up. And then he began getting companies that publish standards and Broadway shows and, really big publishers. And, with the help of Lee Eastman, who knew this world inside out. And ultimately, when he was negotiating to go to Columbia, or, when he was negotiating to go to wherever he was going to go in the States in 1979, there were several labels vying for his attentions. What sort of put Columbia over the edge was they had a publishing company, and they signed it over to Paul as part of a deal that also gave him, an incredible royalty rate and a huge advance. But I think it was the publishing company that really sort of sealed the deal, because it was, they showed that they were able to cater to Paul's other interests besides music, and or besides making his own music. So there is that sideline career as a publisher that sort of weaves all through the book in pretty much the same way the Beatles weave all through the book. There's a lot of different
Because
kinds.
you also see Warner Brothers. You also see Warner Brothers trying to persuade him over to Warner Brothers with helping his brother with the McGear album as well.
Yeah, I think that there was genuine interest from Warner in signing Paul in '75, and I don't think a lot of people really realised that Paul regained the copyright for Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You in '75 as part of re-signing with Capitol and EMI. And to get to the bottom of all of the publishing details, we actually had to source Paul's publishing catalogues every time one came out. So throughout the 70s, MPL published these publishing catalogues, and I've got them sat in one of these cupboards behind me, actually, these big, thick books. And they document all of the songs Paul owned at that particular time. So we had to scan through these books, and it was through those that we saw that he'd regained control of Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You in '75. Yeah.
Which were previously owned by Ardmore and Beechwood, right?
That's right, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, the Eastmans did an incredible job for him as his business advisors, and every contract he signed in the '70s, he got some incredible deal. But as you would expect for someone of Paul's caliber, really.
Let's open it up to some viewer questions that have been submitted in the comments here, and I'm going to fire up the first one here, which is actually directed to Adrian. This is from John Bazzini. John asks, my question to Adrian, if MPL is not assisting with the research, how difficult is it to acquire the session information?
Well, I mean, we were very fortunate with this book, for example, that we spoke with, we spoke with every recording engineer that worked with Wings during this period, and quite a number of them, would keep personal diaries and session logs. So, somebody like Peter Henderson, for example, who did the Wings at the Speed of Sound sessions, he kept a diary which documented everything he did with Wings, down to what overdubs they would do each day. So we were very fortunate to work with these recording engineers. Alan O'Duffy, the same. Tim Summerhays, who worked on the Rack Mobile, which did the sessions for Back to the Egg and Mull of Kintyre and things like that. Again, he had a lot of information. There really wasn't one universal source of information that we could go to and just say, okay, this is all the session information. The deluxe box sets, if you look inside those, there's a lot of information in them as well.
Yes.
And there are, some session logs and things like that we would use, but we would always cross-reference them with, secondary sources to get, as close to, an accurate date as we could possibly find. But yeah, piecing together the sessions, that took probably, at least half of the research time, because really it's half of the book, isn't it, really, the sessions?
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. John, thank you for your question. Let's go, actually, not too far from here. Let's go over to Dublin and highlight Mr. Owen Ling's question here, ever the polarizing one. The late Neil Innes said that McCartney was the least comfortable with the Rutles. Having written 2 books, can you offer an answer why that might be, Allan or Adrian?
Well, Paul is not portrayed all that sympathetically in the Rutles. There's this scene at the end when he marries, Bianca Jagger. I can't remember what name they used, but and it's Eric Idle is playing Paul, and he's marries Bianca Jagger, and he's sitting at a piano and he's pounding away on chords, and it's like, I love you. And it is sort of like a searing parody of, what the worst Paul McCartney hater would say his music was. So I could understand how he might not have been comfortable with that. I'm not sure what his feeling about the main part of the film was, though. I can't think of anything that objectionable. Can you?
He just never seemed to be the one to really feel comfortable with that. Taking the Mickey out of him. John and George much more suited to that. They didn't mind it as much. Paul just always seemed to be a little bit frosty about it all.
Yeah, I think in the background during that period, they were putting out quite a lot of fires when it came to things like that. We spoke with a guy called Sam Trust, who was formerly the head of ATV Publishing, and he said that they spent a lot of time and resources shutting down productions in America, for example, that would use the Beatles' music and their likelihoods on stage, and there were some productions that were kind of given the green light. There was the Sgt. Pepper stage show, and Beatlemania was another one. But Paul didn't like Beatlemania either. I think anything that kind of took their image and like you say, parodied it, or presented them in a light that he wasn't particularly comfortable with, Paul didn't like that. And you'll see that in the book, really. Some of the hard conversations that Paul would have with Sam Trust about, why are these things happening? Why haven't we got any control over them? And really, Paul was the one out of the 4 Beatles who was driving that and trying to stop these amateur productions from happening.
Right. Here's a great question from James Boyce. I know that Adrian had given up on speaking to Joe English, but how did that happen in the end, and how was he?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at the interview date in the footnotes, I think it was about 2 or 3 days before we delivered our final manuscript that I spoke to Joe. It was that close to the deadline, and I had given up on speaking to him. I've actually been doing a little bit of consultancy work on a documentary about Paul's life, and I've got the producers of that film to thank for connecting me with Joe. They were the ones that helped me build a bridge with Joe, and I eventually did get to speak to him. It was a really, I did 2 interviews with Joe, and they were really 2 of the toughest interviews I think I did for the whole project, because having spoken with Jeff, he was so open and candid and honest. I felt that maybe Joe was at the opposite end of the spectrum. He's been out of the public eye for so long. And he was a bit of a closed book, really. So trying to get him to open up about his time in Wings was really hard. And it's really difficult when you're an interviewer because you have to respect the boundaries of other people and, you know, respect that there are certain things that they don't want to talk about as much as you would like them to talk about them. But yeah, you know, you will see in the book that we explore some difficult things that were happening in Joe's life that led to his departure from Wings. And yeah, it was through those conversations that we kind of got more details about those, really. But yeah, it was. I was over the moon, to be honest with you, to actually just get the final Wings drummer, you know, in the can, so to speak. It was a real relief to speak with Joe and a real honour, actually, because not many people have actually, you know, interviewed Joe English, and he was a really, really nice guy. And I think he gets a bit of a hard time because he's withdrawn from, you know, doing interviews, and because, you know, he's devoted his life to religion now. You know, maybe he gets a bit of a hard time for that. But you know, when you read some of the things that happened to his wife in the book, you know, you maybe understand why his life took that turn, and really why he made some of those decisions later in his life. So
he's. Because, you know, I'm on the chapter of recording Speed of Sound, and, you know, prior, you know, from that time, from when he joins up to that time, he seems like he's having a good time. He seems like he's enjoying, you know, being in the band.
He is, but he was very homesick, you know, and his wife or girlfriend at the time was not living with him in England. Paul offered to get them a house and you know, anything it would take to keep Joe in the group, because Joe was, you know, beginning to wobble a bit before he actually left, and so his girlfriend Dale and her daughter came over to London and you know, to see how it was, and they just didn't like it. I mean, they were living in rural Georgia. It's very different than London. And it just wasn't their cup of tea, and they said, you know, can't do it. And so that left Joe with you know, potential choice to make. You know, can I make this work or not? But Joe was, you know, also lonely and homesick and wanted to be with them, and he ultimately made that choice and left. So,
and it was really nice to see that really for the first few months he was living there, the McCartneys basically took him in as a house guest for a long while until they got him his own flat.
Yeah, and you know, out of all these things come little details that, you know, finally explain something else. So we now know that the door chime that you hear at the beginning of Let Him In was a gift that Joe bought them, you know, after they had allowed him to stay there for so long. He just decided to get them something, and there it was, and now it's on the record.
It's one of the great privileges of this project, actually, is being able to bring Paul's private life and his life in the studio together, and to see how they interweave with one another, and how he had these human connections with his band members and not just professional connections. And we've been incredibly lucky to speak with, you know, now every surviving member of Wings. You know, it would have been nice to speak with Denny Lane, you know, when he was alive, and again that was a very frustrating one, you know, trying to connect with Denny during the time we were working on this project. But you know, luckily for us, Denny was already very well represented through archival interviews. But we've struck some, you know, incredible connections with the other members of Wings through working on these two books, which has been a real honor and an awful lot of fun, to be honest.
Yeah, Lawrence Juber and Steve Hawley were, you know, very open about, you know, not only giving us a lot of time and, you know, being very forthright in their discussions of their time with Wings, but also, you know, during the writing, you know, just some little detail would come up that we hadn't covered in the interviews, and they were fine about immediately answering emails with questions. So, you know, they were just great. And Steve Hawley would have been another drummer in the series with a diary, but he lost them.
Oh,
Yeah. He had kept them, but he lives in New York now, and somewhere in the trip from moving house from London to New York, the diaries went missing.
It's amazing that the musicians kept diaries. I mean, even going back to Denny Seiwell, Jeff Britton, it's amazing that they kept all this down to have it and preserved. And now you guys can use it as a research and present it and have it now, which is fantastic.
Yeah. I mean, you get the feeling with some of it was possibly down to them logging the time they were doing in the studios so that they could file their musician union forms.
Yeah.
But yeah, they also collected their memories in them as well. I think someone earlier today when we were doing an interview suggested that it's because they were they're the timekeepers in the band. So maybe that's the reason why they were keeping time. Yeah.
Got a great question here from our friend Beatley Tone. Tony asks, were you able to connect with any of Jimmy McCulloch's family/friends to get any backstories on his time with Wings?
I mean, Jimmy's story was one of the most difficult to tell, because to a lot of people and, in a lot of McCartney biographies, Jimmy's depicted as just a troublemaker. And as a journalist, you have a responsibility to give a two-sided story. And in Jimmy's case, we couldn't do that because the guy's dead. And he has no what we call right of reply in the journalist world. So the biggest thing from our perspective was to try and give a balanced account of Jimmy's time in the band, his highs and his lows, and give some rationale maybe for the reason why he acted the way he did. I mean, we found out certain things through reading Paul Sally's book about Jimmy McCulloch because he interviewed Jack. So that was a good source for us. But generally speaking, the portrait we've painted of Jimmy comes from, everybody who was around Jimmy at the time, including some interviews with Paul that you might not have read before, where he talks about Jimmy in quite a lot of detail and talks about, Jimmy's family and, like I say, some explanation and rationale behind why Jimmy was the way he was. Because I think it's very easy to paint Jimmy as a pint-size troublemaker when really he was a very talented musician. He was just very troubled, and had issues with alcohol and drug addiction, and it's a very tragic story, Jimmy's. And I hope people don't come away from our book thinking that we've just done the usual thing of let's all bash Jimmy.
Also, people like Tony Dorsey and Aubrey Powell, a lot of the people who toured with Wings had some really interesting observations about Jimmy and why he did what he did, and his behavior at certain times. These were people who noticed when he made trouble, they were there and they saw it, but they were also friendly with him, and I think they were sympathetic to him, and so it was good hearing from them all.
You see him in interviews too, talking about how his time with Wings, he wanted to create something that he could be proud of. So it seemed like he was also in it to be successful as well, and not just be a troublemaker.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that came through, I think it was through an interview with Aubrey Powell, who was, most people will know as Poe. He was the guy who was the cover designer, who did things like, Band on the Run, worked for Hypnosis. And I think it was Aubrey that said that, Jimmy really thought that Wings would make him a star and that he would go on to have solo success. But then when Jimmy tried to branch out and do solo singles with White Line, he just didn't have any success at all. I mean, I don't think that single even charted in England or America. So I think it was a very frustrating time for Jimmy. He thought that maybe he could branch out beyond Wings and become a star in his own right. And then he had to, he found himself basically resigned to the shadows with his bandmates because, the much debated question, isn't it? Was Wings a band or was it just Paul and Sidemen? Well, I mean, for Jimmy, he felt that they were a band, and then he could become a star himself. But eventually he realized he was just a sideman for Paul.
Sad, sad. I do love the little bit in the book about Paul's relationship with hypnosis, and I'm not going to give it away, but that was a great little tidbit of a story in there about that with a little bit of a frostiness. Awesome little part of history there between hypnosis and Paul with Venus and Mars. You'll have to read the book. Question from Bob Ward: were you able to shed any light on Paul and George's relationship in the 1970s? Short answer, obviously. We don't need to give it away too much.
Yes, I think we were. I think, we did what we could to shed light on the relationships of Paul with all of the former Beatles, and, which we could do simply by reporting on the times they met, which were, not that plentiful. But, also in George's case, there was a time when Paul was given an award by Guinness Book of World Records, and George thought that Paul was just being self-promotional, that he had sought out this award, and called Paul on the phone and basically excoriated him for doing this. And Paul said, "Wait a minute, they just gave me a thing. I didn't apply for this, But we see a lot of interactions like that, but we also see Paul putting on an afro wig and a mustache and sunglasses and going to hear George's concert in New York when he was on tour. So, they had an up and down relationship, just like Paul and John did. And, the only one who never has really a down relationship with anyone seems to be Ringo.
Although, if you read that recent book of interviews, the interview with Ringo that was done in 1980, Ringo said that him and Paul weren't talking. So, which was fascinating to read.
Yeah.
That was the Stephen Gaines and Peter Brown book.
Oh, right.
In England, I think it's called All the Love You. It had a different title to the American version. But yeah, in there, Ringo said that him and Paul weren't talking in 1980. So that was the first we'd heard of that.
That's interesting too.
Yeah.
Question here from Tony asks, did you guys interview Howie Casey?
We sure did, yeah. I can remember it very well, actually. It was around this time of year, and it must have been about 8 years ago. I was down at my in-laws' place, and me and Howie talked for about 3 hours, and he walked me through all of his time over in Hamburg with Paul and the Beatles, all the way through to the last concerts they played together. And, he told me some really interesting things that will probably, go forward into the next book. So when the tour ended in 1980, one of the questions we asked all of them was, did you get paid? And they all said that they did, even though the Japanese tour was cancelled. And he said that when he and his wife went to buy a house down in Brighton, I think it was, that Paul helped them pay for the deposit. And when Howie offered to pay the money back, Paul said that he didn't want it. So you hear some of these really interesting stories from musicians that maybe people who think that Paul's really tight will be very interested to read in our third book when it comes around.
Right. And Japan's a funny thing for Paul in his solo career, right? I mean, he gets denied to go there while they're playing in Australia. Obviously the bust. Didn't he get sick in Japan a few years back too? While he was touring there, I believe. But yeah, Japan just seems to be like a thorn in his side.
Somehow.
Yeah, I don't know if he would characterize it that way. I think he likes going there. I mean, he goes there an awful lot now. I don't know, but it has been an unusual relationship, Paul, in Japan, because of the busts and being denied in 1975, having his visa rescinded. So. Yeah, I mean, we'll find out more about it in the future volumes when he finally does get to play there again. We'll see how that goes.
If the Minister of Japan says we can't come, then we can't come in.
Yeah, I mean, there's always the speculation about 1980. You know, did Paul take that bag of marijuana with him? You know, just to make a point when he, you know, from having had his visa rescinded in 1975.
Right.
Was that kind of like a show of defiance in some way? It must have been, you know, in some subconscious way that was some sort of act of defiance from him.
But they made those tour jackets for Japan, and man, they are awesome. If you have one of those are a collectible. Man, do either of you guys have one of those?
Nope.
Question here from good friend of the show, Tom Liverani. We've heard two reasons for the delay in starting the 76 U.S. tour. Was it Jimmy's broken finger or the death of Paul's dad?
Well, it was Jimmy's broken finger. Paul's dad died before the European arm of the tour earlier, wasn't it? Earlier,
yeah, it was in March. Yeah.
But there were several stories about the broken finger. There was the official story that he slipped in the bathroom in his hotel in Paris. And he insisted on that, and Paul insisted on that too. But what we found was that something else actually happened. It was another episode of misbehavior, and I'll leave that to people to dig out.
And you can dig it out of the book and read it. But yeah, that's an interesting question there.
He seemed also very keen on getting rid of the mother. I mean, his stepmom and stepsister for a while there too.
Ooh.
It seemed like he didn't want his dad to be around Angie, was it?
Angie,
yes.
yes.
Yeah, I mean,
that was sad. That was sad.
That's an uncomfortable relationship to explore. And again, you know, Angie's written some books herself. And what we've really done is contextualize quite a lot of maybe what Angie's talked about before, plus some other stuff. You know, and really place it in the times and places when these certain events happened. And yeah, some of that makes for uncomfortable reading. But I believe that they're on good terms now, Angie and Paul. I think they put all of that behind them. But yeah, that build up to the European leg of the world tour in 1976 is really fascinating. The fact that Paul's dad dies and he decides to carry on with the tour. And then he arrives the next day, is it in Copenhagen, you know, with his kind of fingers raised in the air. And I think the way we describe it is it's another example of that great ability Paul has to separate himself into two personalities. There's me and him. And, you know, me was mourning his father and him was being the performer, the consummate performer that Paul is. But yeah, that's a fascinating chapter to read, really, with all of that playing out in Paul's life and how he reacts to it.
Because he reveres his father so much, especially in his older age, retelling stories and little vignettes and little spoken phrases that his father would say. But then to not go to his own father's funeral, he couldn't face it, according to what Mike says.
I mean, he has an uncomfortable relationship with death, does Paul, and it probably stems from losing his mother when he was 14. That it's just not something he really wants to face up to. It's been interesting hearing him explore his mortality through song in, you know, some of his recent albums. It's something he certainly wouldn't have done, you know, back in this period.
No.
Yeah.
Not at all. We're going to have a couple more questions, and we're going to start winding it down here. We have a question here from Beetle Eddie. He asks, does the book discuss the visit of Paul visiting John at Dakota and almost going on Saturday Night Live? I heard they were stoned, and that's why they did not go.
I think they just decided not, put yourself in their position. It's midnight or later, and they're watching a TV show in the Dakota. They haven't rehearsed anything. Are they going to just get up, get in a cab, go down to SNL, and say, "Well, we're here"? It's not very realistic. They probably were stoned. I mean, that's very possible. But it's. Everyone has different stories about it. I mean, Chevy Chase claimed that they were on their way, but John's driver got lost. Now, however many of your listeners are New Yorkers, the route from the Dakota to 30 Rock, where SNL is taped, is not very complicated, nor is it very far. And if I were John and my driver couldn't find the way from the Dakota to there, I'd fire him immediately.
It's a straight run, pretty much.
Yeah.
Down you go. Good question there, Russ. Thank you. Oh no, the Beatle lady. One more little question. This is a good one here. Russ asks, did you find out any info with the 1979 New York Times article stated, quote, Paul, George, and Ringo reunite Pachia in 1979? Any truth behind that story?
Yeah, that was another one of those where what happened was that they were originally it was claimed that they were going to play a charity concert, and there was no truth behind it. And it's something you can read in the book. And in the end, Paul agreed to do the concert for Kampuchea as a sort of compensation for this charity concert that never was. But yeah, the idea of them reuniting, again, you'll have to read the book. But a lot of it was just press spin. Basically, any time two of the Beatles were in town together, they were reuniting.
Always.
And I think that was pretty much the story, kind of, going forward through the decades, wasn't it? So
certainly was. All right, so we're going to close it out for the questions in the chat. So thank you for that. As we wind down, I'm going to ask one final question here. So we've got Volume 2. We know that it ends in January 1980. Volume 3, gentlemen, what can we expect? And everybody wants to know, where would you cut off Volume 3? Everybody's been asking that question.
Well, where we cut it off is a little difficult. We're thinking of Volume 3 as the 80s. But of course, 89, the end of 89, starts a tour. So do we cut it off at the start of the tour, before the tour, after the tour in 1990? We have some time to figure that out.
Good. Well-deserved time to figure it out, because you guys have spent a decade research and writing both of these books, and it's incredible. And those of you that have got it today, it's out now everywhere, Amazon. Please do your best to pick it up. This is going to be the McCartney Bible for the ages, forever, written by both these gentlemen. And those of you that have wanted to read about Paul and follow his life, with or without the Beatles and Wings, this is going to be it. And we have it. And it's a fantastic day. And it has been so awesome talking to you both today to field some questions and get Volume 2 out there and off the ground, pun intended. I can't wait to read that chapter. I can't read through that chapter when you get to the 90s.
Yeah, let's reconvene in January. Hopefully we'll have the book finished by then, and we can get back together and ask more questions.
Yeah,
absolutely.
We'll do a proper recap of all the really good tidbits in here. And God, there's so many. Every couple days, I'll turn a page and go, wow. I mean, all the nuggets of detail that you've uncovered, even things down to like Wings left and boarded the plane at 3:50 on September 19th, and I'm like, this is something really excruciating. This is detail, man. It's fantastic.
Yeah. I mean, when people ask us about that book, I always have to remind them that when you're holding those 2 volumes in your hands, you're holding 10 years of our lives in your hands, really. That's what it is, So that's how much time and work went into them.
One of my favorite bits of the book is I like to think that I'm, sexually innuendo savvy, but the bit about "she's my baby" had me on the floor laughing my ass off, because for some reason it just never occurred to me about those lyrics, representing, what you guys are making it to sound like it's representing, and I love it. I just absolutely love it.
I think Alan was in your camp as well. I think it was me that pointed that out to him.
Right.
That's the dirty Brit in the camp.
Well, he's always he's always done this a little bit with his lyrics. Come on. So it's not too hard to think that Paul might take lyrics and put them with that little innuendo on them somehow.
Oh no, he does it frequently, but I think I just hadn't really I hadn't really wanted to see that one. I mean, I saw the possibility and thought, no, he doesn't mean that.
Nah, it can't be. Not this song, right? Like, why would this song be that? Then you're like, oh.
Down to the last drop, baby.
Oh, God, I don't even want to think about that. But we're going to wrap it up here for today. That's going to do it for episode number 267 of Two Legs. The McCartney Legacy, Volume 2, 1974 to 1980, is out everywhere now, written by Allan Kozinn and Adrian Sinclair. Please support these two fine gentlemen and the 10 years of work that they have done putting and chronicling Paul's life post-Beatles, which for us solo McCartney fans has been something we've wanted for decades. And the Bible, so to speak, for in our purposes, is here. And I cannot wait to spend the next few weeks finishing it, looking at my little bookmark. I'm up to 312. So I'm going to keep motoring on. And it's going to come on a flight with me really, really soon. So,
it'll make you overweight.
If I put that thing on the scale and then they tell you well, maybe I'll just take the PDF. We'll see.
So it's 1.5 kilos apparently.
Oh my God! But no, it's been a pleasure. Congratulations to you, Allan, and to you, Adrian, on this remarkable piece of work. Cheers! Your book is out, and you deserve all the congratulations and the everything that's coming your way, because the work and the level of detail and research is off the charts, and we are better as fans, researchers, and scholars for it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. And
all right,
have a
everybody.
Wonderful Christmas time, everybody.
Absolutely, baby. From the McCartney store. Have a wonderful Christmas time. So, for my partner in crime, Time Hunyadi, you feel better, buddy. Hang in there. For Allan Kozinn and Adrian Sinclair, I'm Andy Nichols, signing off for episode 267. And we'll see you next time, as the man says.